and thank you for joining us again for another episode of the Spatial Web AI podcast. Today I have a very special guest. John Henry Clippinger is with us today. He is the co-founder of Bioform Labs. He is also the founding advisor for the Active Inference Institute, and he is a research scientist for the MIT Lab City Sciences Group. John, thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to our show.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Yep.
Let me give a little more context to my background as well, see as relevant to this conversation. Yes, I've been at MIT, the Media Lab, City Science Group, and before that with Sandy Pentland and his Human Dynamics Group. And he and I developed started a foundation called ID Cubed. So sort of digital institutions, decentralization. We sort of anticipated blockchain, things like that. Much of the issues about privacy and with self-sovereignty and things like that. And before that, I was at Harvard at the Berkman Center, and founded something called the Law Lab. In my background, to get my PhD a long time ago in AI and linguistics, and started some companies around that. So I've had a long interest in artificial intelligence in the early form and been tracking it. And so when it really sort of crossed this new threshold, that I became really re-engaged and felt like, okay, this is a whole new era. It's really beginning as a science. It's just not a lot of collections of sort of programming techniques. And so became really, really interested in it, and particularly with the work of Karl Friston. I felt that his work really sort of pulled it together, pushed it into a whole nother threshold. I'd been involved, I started several companies in artificial intelligence, particularly natural language processing. I wrote a book on that. And been interested in involved with the Santa Fe Institute and complexity science and self-organizing system, all of that. And that tied into the stuff of blockchain and autonomous, decentralized autonomous organizations. But it was really Karl's work that I think pulled it together, tied it into physics, gave it a principled way of thinking. And it's quite transformative for me. And actually, that's how I first came to it through, I just discovered it on the web and looking at a lecture that Maxwell Ramstad did. Which really, and I got to know Maxwell and what he was doing, and really impressed. And then we got on a number of the calls and networks that he had with Karl. I see what's going on. I worked with Maxwell for projects, but very, very, we were very sort of taken by what they were able to do. And then Maxwell went on. I actually introduced him to Versus and the people of the Spatial Web Foundation. I was very interested in the Spatial Web Foundation early on, because I think the whole idea of spatial computing and being a principled basis of protecting data and governing is really foundational, and we're moving into that new era where we're explaining things by models, really. I mean, that and becoming digital twins, and that again ties into Karl's work. So all this sort of comes together, and I think we're moving into a whole new era. The motivation partly just back up. It's also a director of the Active Inference Foundation, and in working and being in that capacity, really interested in saying, how do you get people to understand it, where it's going? And I've always been involved in open source software. I've been very interested in that and making a public good. That's been part of my career and interest, and that's part of the rationale for the Active Inference Foundation. And then I was also part of something called the Boston Global Forum, which is a group, it's in Boston, but it's really global. And there the interest was increasingly in artificial intelligence, is saying, how do we create safe artificial intelligence? How do we make it a public good? The interest spanned not just in the U.S., but around the world. And that forum is an attempt to bring in people cross disciplines. There's a big disconnect, as you might imagine, between policy people and tech people. And I've been in government. I've done a lot of policy work. And so I know they speak two different languages. And I think this is, so it's really important not to have them sort of, the policymakers look at it as an afterthought, but really understand the principles and how transformative it is. So that was really a little background and context for why I'm engaged in these things, particularly writing the letter that we did.
Yeah, and just to back up to what you had said about verses, I actually was speaking with Dan the other day, and I told him that I would be interviewing you, and he said that they really owe you so much gratitude because you played a real significant part in their early days, introducing them to Maxwell and therefore Karl as well. So, yeah.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you said that. Yeah. No, I was really interested in what they're doing. They were really ahead of the trend. And the fact that it's going through the IEEE, I think is pretty profound. Yeah. And so I saw the connection there. But I think where I am now thinking and working is really, and as part of the idea of Bioform Labs, our collaborations with different people, is that we're seeing this transition in AI. It's going to be in everything. And you really do not have a principled governance approach to it. I was very much involved in privacy and this whole area of self-sovereign identity and data at the Berkman Center. I was involved in the World Economic Forum and working with some of those policies. I was very concerned that that regulation is always much slower and it's sort of like an afterthought. And suddenly they slap a lot of things on and you have a lot of adverse effects. You really don't understand that people are playing to the trends and things like that. And so it's really, as I said earlier, it's really important to get a principled understanding of these things. And the current narrative is so much captured. It's so much captured by these extreme claims about the AGI, the superintelligence taking us over. It's Arnold Schwarzenegger, the Terminator, at the end times. And I think that actually it's a very powerful technology that's an understanding. In my view, intelligence and life and what it means to be alive are really interconnected. I mean, right. Karl makes this point. It's like I am alive because I can make predictions, and I think Andy Clark, his new book, makes this point very, very well. And so, what is information? What is energy? What is intelligence? What does it mean to stay alive? There are many kinds of intelligence, and I think that's in the work that you find in Michael Levin. That's a very distributed thing. It's not a kind of thing. There's not a uniform monolithic intelligence. I think a lot of this is just projecting onto the machine. Now we're starting to see the limitations of large language models and transformers. And they start to be really apparent. I wrote a piece, calling it it could be called a parlor trick, like a Ouija board, because people are pushing it around. It's a Ouija board with memory, and they sort of ascribe certain things to it. And I think, yet I do think there's some really fundamental things that's very profound that's been done as a list. I think they really, the transformer models are very powerful in understanding semantics and things we didn't before. I mean, so it's really, I don't want to dismiss that at all, but I do think the way the current narrative is that, okay, it's only going to be running really big models. You got to give it to big tech. I don't think you have to run big models. I think you need causal models. I don't think you need all those parameters, blah, 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 all that. So I think we're moving to that new transition, the next generation that's coming about.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say that, because to me, that's how I see this too, is that, I mean, when you look at human knowledge, right, and these, autonomous systems are going to be extensions of human knowledge. And the way human knowledge grows is by a diversity of a lot of different minds, a lot of different intelligences, a lot of different levels of understanding and viewpoints and all of that that kind of converge and interact, and it makes this global knowledge get bigger. And you can't do that with one brain or one big machine. You'll just have a reiteration of the same information. There won't be there won't be expanding to the knowledge from there. Is that how you see it as well?
I totally agree. I think that, you see this in nature. That just as there are many different kinds of body types that are adapted to different situations. There's not one, there are different kinds of intelligence. Intelligence and body types go together. There are different kinds of life forms that exist, and they have different kind of niches. And then they combine together to create different kind of ecosystems. And so we're really understanding the biology of intelligence, the biology of what it means to be a living thing, and and that's very different than the mechanical reductionist notion, and that's why I think it's really important to keep this an open research. We're just at the beginning of understanding this. I think it's analogous to where synthetic biology was, in the sense that were experiments that this came out. You really want to keep it open and growing and being able to involve lots of people in being able to develop and contribute to those intelligence. That's been my posture. And that was sort of the motivation for the letter as well.
Yeah. And so I really do want to get to the letter. And, maybe I was going to start in a different spot, but, to continue with what you're talking about, one of the things that was really interesting to me in the letter, and I think it was when it was talking about these machine learning models, the transformers, the LLMs, and that engineering approachments and advancements were made with no scientific principles or independent performance standards referenced or applied to the direct research and development. And, that's a really important point. And so maybe we can take it from there and start there with, why is that a problem?
Well, I see, I think AI, and as I really involved in many years. I was at the MIT AI lab way back when, and so there was not any underlying science. There wasn't. It wasn't based on first principle. It was really computer science being applied to a problem and see what we could do. And you had many leaps and lurches around that. You had symbolic computing, you had certain neural nets and what you could do with neural nets. And yes, you had McCulloch and Pitts, they had a neural net model. It's an approximate to a physical model. But then I think what you're now seeing, and this is what, again, it gets back to Karl. I have to go to him. It is going back to physics and first principles in physics, and the Hamiltonian, the least action, free energy. You can actually start to build systems based upon first principles and test them against first principles as a science. That's a huge shift. If we think we can look at the physics of the mind and how the mind works, and with the same rigor that we can start to understand the physics of physical system or even biological systems and make claims about that, then that really changes how we look at our social institutions or economic institutions. The whole idea of extended cognition, I think, is extremely profound, and you need to base it in first principles. So we have been working with various people like not just Karl, but also Michael Levin and other Chris Fields, and saying, okay, how do we lay down a foundation that's testable in a scientific sense, that we can make certain claims?
Yeah.
And then validate. And a very powerful notion is it scale-free, domain-free? Well, can we really prove that? Can we really show that the same principles work at different scales? That if we can do that, that really changes the game. And I think we can do that. So that's why that's so important.
Well, okay, so then let's talk about the letter. So, you played a key role in writing this letter, and, what was the inspiration? What was the purpose for it? Why did you think now is the time? And, what was the goal in writing this letter?
Well, it really was, it was sort of it's a frustration that you're hearing the public narrative captured to a certain point of view. And that having been in the field for a really long time and talking to other people, you say, wait a second, this is being misframed. And now as it's misframed, then the misframing is being exploited by different parties to push a particular view and a business model on top of this, which I don't necessarily agree to. So I really felt, and I sort of tested the waters, and I said, am I the only one? And no, it resonated with a lot of people. And so,
who were some of the others that joined you in this?
well, I mean, one of the first was Chris Fields, but then Karl came in, and Karl was very sympathetic to it. But then there was a whole other. There were some of the people in the active inference world, but it was broader than that. It reached out to a broader community, but also through Boston Global Forum, we're able to reach with people who were on the policy side. And I really wanted to make that link. I just didn't want to make it just a tech or science field, but saying, yes, we're trying to bring together different people to really think about this thing freshly and not have it be captive to a small particular interest spinning out of Silicon Valley, basically. Right. And so that was really the motivation for it. So we went through a number of iterations and letters. David Silberswig, who was dean of the Harvard Medical School and also head of the neuroscience division at Harvard, he was very active in that. He contributed to it because he's very interested in developing a new way of thinking about mental health instead of using these principles and looking at mental health beyond the skull and saying collective mental health. And what we see is, can we link what's going on outside? Is there a way in which we can see these things together? So he and Karl synchrony in that. And so there's a bigger community that's coming.
Yeah, I was just going to say what's really interesting about that particular notion is I think a lot of the mental health issues that we're experiencing these days are a result of our interaction with tech.
I totally agree. And we have I'm a little bit fanatical about that because there are other, because I think that what we've done is we've created algorithms of exploitation and depression and addiction at such a level, and we monetize that. And we don't have a policy means of saying, hey, that's an opiate, where they're selling opiates out there.
Yeah.
We have a principled way, just as we do in medicine, say that is an opiate. Can we say that's an opiate and a cognitive opiate? That's a cognitive opiate. That's a cognitive addiction. So I'm working on a paper on the whole notion of when ideologies become pathologies. Can you really say an ideology is a collection of Bayesian beliefs that perform in a particular way, but do they exhibit the patterns of something that's addictive or like cancer? So can we really apply those terms rigorously to mental states and collective mental states? I think so. But you just can't throw it out there as a metaphor. You really have to actually ground it in your science, Right. So we're looking at being able to, and Karl started early work on this, but David's involved in this and being able to say, okay, we can do a scan of the brain and map the characteristics of that to on a collective and individual level and see what's happening. That changes policy big time. And so it also gets into misstatements. So is this a misstatement or not? Do we have a principled way of saying what is hate speech? What is the misuse of speech to create an addiction or some other, and can we base that on a principled way? Do we have a way of stating rigorously what a fact is? And so I can go on and on. Well, it's because there's a whole overlap between scientific method and jurisprudence. In other words, what is a fact? How can I prove it in science? And then in jurisprudence, what is evidence? What's a consensus? What are the rules of evidence? What kind of conclusions I can draw? And can I have a computational model? Can I have something that computationally represents that in a rigorous form that I can replicate it and explain it? Now, you can't do that with LLM models. You can't do that close, but you can do that with these new models.
Ooh, and what's interesting about that is that, I mean, we're entering into a future where we're going to have these intelligent agent assistants, like that are
Absolutely.
gonna be our life assistants, our teachers, our mental health professionals.
Well, well, maybe we'll get a better sense of their mental health than some of the mental health professionals. I mean, you can actually, you, you can actually, I mean, what I'm interested in is there a ground truth that you can establish? It's never
Yeah.
an absolute truth, but you can upgrade it and you can understand what it's based upon. And so, do I trust this agent? How far do I trust this agent? And this again is where active inference is very good, because it gives you a variational free energy principle for measuring the level at which you have uncertainty about certain claims or data. And so you could upgrade that. So it's very overt about what it doesn't know. And I think it sort of codifies the scientific method as, I think, can be a principle of governance. So that's the other thing I'm interested in.
Yeah. So, and I'm sorry because I interrupted your train of thought on this letter.
Oh,
And for the viewers who aren't sure exactly what we're speaking about here with this
okay.
letter, the title of the letter was "Natural AI Based on the Science of Computational Physics and Neuroscience: Policy and Societal Significance."
Right.
And so, please continue with how you gathered all these people, you realized everybody is on the same page, sees kind of the same need and significance of really bringing this next generation of artificial intelligence to the public forum. So, yeah, continue, please.
Well, I mean, what has happened is that there is now it's picked up. It's another phase, and we're saying, well, how do we encourage different groups to adopt this particular perspective? So we have been approached by universities and others and other research groups to say, yeah, we like the central proposition, the natural AI, keeping it open, and how can we develop repositories and things that actually function this way? And so we're in the early phases of that. But it hit a chord with a number of folks. And I really do think you're seeing sort of the exposure, the cracks in the current model, and then people exposing it, and now they're asking these questions. And so, where do we go from here, and how do we shape that, and how do we really make sure that it doesn't become captive and it grows as a public good, as a public resource?
Right.
Where we are.
Yeah, and in the letter, you talk about prosocial benefits of natural intelligence approach. So, maybe you could speak about that, and what are the prosocial benefits?
Well, I mean, I think there are many. I mean, there's several things that we've mentioned, the whole idea of collective mental health or extended cognition, and being able to a new way of framing that. I mean, the other area that I'm very interested in, but involved in over the years, is in climate change. And so I've involved in a company, it's called Clear Trace. We actually start with NFTs that validate certification of production of green energy, solar primarily. And then Open Earth Foundation was one of the founding directors of that. Now working with some other projects. And the big challenge to climate change is being able to have people believe the measures. You have the ESGs, you have all these other measurements, and then you have measurements that are in different domains at different scales. And how do you relate them? Is there an underlying organizing principle? I actually had talked to Karl. We organized a call with Karl a number of years ago, talking about something like digital Gaia concept. That because he wrote a piece on the Earth as a living system, the planet as a living system. The question, and I think that is the right perspective. And the question is, how can you start with different kind of measures that reflect the uncertainty associated with, and therefore that uncertainty is associated with allocation of a financial instrument to reflect that uncertainty. But as the uncertainty gets less, you reduce the uncertainty, then you affect his financial instrument. So I worked in some projects with the government of Costa Rica on how to, and basically they're interested in saying how they have 30% of their land masses sort of set aside as a natural, as a reserves. Is there a way they can value that as a natural asset? So can you have assets that are based on nature? Now, how do you value that? And as you get better and better measures, how does that reflect the value of the instrument or the underlying asset? So this is where active inference comes in. And there's so you can tie your measurement uncertainty into the risk associated with a financial instrument. So I'm working with other people on that.
Interesting.
So that there's a number of groups are really interested. That's a big issue. And if you can crack that nut, then you get a lot of people to contribute. They believe in this is why they believe in the metric, because it's explainable, and therefore they can assign value to it, and then you can attract capital, and then you can scale it. So I think that is the only way we're going to really address climate change at scale. And so it comes back to really having a valid way of measuring things that's transparent, that upgrades itself, that reflects it what it doesn't know, and that reflects itself in a particular kind of bond or financial instruments.
Yeah, it's interesting because that's one of the things that I've recognized with the with what the Spatial Web Protocol will do in, taking us into these 3D digital twin spaces that are now programmable, because then once everything becomes a digital twin, you can run simulations and you can't really argue with it because now you have scientists that are like, we see this as the potential outcome. We see this as the potential outcome. And then you have people just going, well, I don't believe it. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But if you have concrete calculations that are telling you.
I tell you, one of the things we experimented with was actually creating a digital twin of something. And as your data gets better, your resolution of the digital twin gets better. So you just think a tree was highly pixelated, but then you get drilled down, you understand more and more the dynamics of the tree, then you can predict more about this behavior. Therefore, your data is more balanced, and you see that, and people can work towards a common goal.
Yeah.
So you can have, so this is like an active inference. You can submit policies around observations or actions you take in order to reduce the uncertainty, and you can get compensated for that. And so you have a principled way of getting people compensated that contributes to an outcome. And that's to me is a new kind of governance principle. And you can visually see it. So this is where it gets to the Spatial Web Protocol. I can see something coming into being, and I can work with other people, and I get a very good model of it. And therefore that's generated value, and therefore there should be some kind of allocation of value for that.
Yeah, you can really, with a system like that, you can create bespoke futures. You know exactly what steps to take to get the outcomes that you're looking for, because you're able to run it and see the predictions.
Simulation is huge, and you can run you can explore a huge space that way. So Autodesk has a lot, with Autodesk, I don't know if you're familiar with what they do, but it's really worth looking into, because you can say, I want to design I can design a whole building, and I can set certain parameters, and then it'll generate different variants of it, and then I can manage the constraints and see what I want, and then I can send it off to a 3D printer, and it can print it. That's where we're going.
Yeah. Fascinating. Wow. Okay. So then, you were talking too about one of the important things of, introducing this idea of the natural approach to, these autonomous systems, and that, it's going to really, it's going to give us a lot of focus on all of the potential outcomes of like AI as a opportunity for our future rather than a threat, and that there are these, existential threats that people are talking about. Do you think that those really are potential outcomes, bad outcomes, if we stick with this, direction that we're in with just focusing on the machine learning and the deep learning?
The analogy, I think, was that Ada Lovelace was wait a minute, she was one first. She said, well, It's machines don't think. You're projecting onto the machine what you think. And Joe Weizenbaum did with the ELIZA program. It's like, oh, there's a very simple little program that simulated a shrink. Everyone projected everything upon it. I think there's a lot of projection, good and ill, and so I don't think it's necessarily in these, because it has no intention and it has no mind of its own. So it's a projection, and that's a projection of the business model. So people just displaying what they're about. I mean, I do think that I did a certain amount of work with government, DoD, or in a whole area of network warfare and decentralized command and control systems. And so when you look in that world, it's hard to tell. I mean, you're looking at what's happening in drones, and I know the person has done interesting things in drones, but you're going to have autonomous drones, and the military is going to drive that, and they can have. So, it is a huge disruptor, and so how these things get shaped is dependent upon the institutional context in which they're derived. I mean, it's not inherent.
And it's the humans that will be stupid with the technology.
Or they project their legacies. Now, ideally, our technology is going to make us smarter. I mean, and collectively smart. It's not it. It's like we're going to get these multiple intelligences. We're going to know what we know, what we don't know, and we're going to be accountable to what we don't know. And that's a big change. We're enforcing accountability around our own stupidity. Well, that's good, and we don't have that. So anyone can make any kind of claim and get away with it. And you say, well, wait a second. No, if we're going to have really valid models, there's a protocol for doing that, and we understand it, and we'll hold it to a high standard. So that I think is a great thing. I think that's huge. That's a very big plus. But you do have to be aware of these institutional contexts in which it's developed, and that's part of my thinking is creating an institutional context that doesn't get twisted, but actually makes the full value of it.
What are your thoughts on the misinformation side of it? Because
I'm really big on that. I mean, I'm really big in trying to correct that. And the thing, and I was working on a piece, and again, it's like, what is a fact? What is evidence? What can I rely upon? And we do have methods. I mean, the legal system absolutely depends upon that. That's why you have a jury of peers that do rule on the evidence. You have a whole set of processes to bring in evidence. So but that is subject to all sorts of exploits, but the whole point of the sort of active inference model is to actually codify a scientific method in such a way that you can actually update, upgrade, and be explicit about your doing. You're not saying you have the 100% answer. There's no such thing as that. But you can say, I know this to a certain degree of confidence, that I can upgrade it, I can scale it. It's totally transparent. So I think eventually we're going to depend upon these kind of things for what we rely upon in trusted agents and certifications of fact. I think that's going to be really, really important. So it's the provenance of the data, where it comes from, and being able to replicate that. To what extent I can rely upon it, we'll have different tests, and then I have agents that embody that, and I'm willing to go with them. And at any point, I can expect them and ask them to explain themselves, unwind themselves, and go back and forth again. That becomes really critical. Again, you can't do that. You can't do that with the current LLMs.
No, they're fed all kinds of information, including a lot of inaccurate information, and
absolutely, when they make it up. I mean, they just make it up.
Oh, because it's so funny. I tell people this all the time. They're trained to spit out an appropriate output, but appropriate and accurate are two different things.
I mean, they're designed to please, whatever. It's like a yes man. Okay, whatever you say. These poor lawyers are getting. They've used legal. I mean, they did the review. I think you saw that at Stanford or where it was. I mean, it generates nonsense, and so
you can lead the witness very easy.
So you really have to curate the databases. You really have to curate these things. But once you do that and you have a trusted, independent a process is based upon first principle, that's a real move ahead for us as a civilization. That's a that's a real upper.
It's interesting because to me, that's the big advantage that I see with this approach, especially when you considering like what Versus is doing, and with the Spatial Web Foundation and the Spatial Web Protocol, that's going to give these intelligent agents facts to develop their understanding of their environment, their frame of reference. It's going to be based on actual real-time program data into all of the things in their interrelationships. And then they get real-time sensory data too. So they're actually dealing with real, in the moment.
Yeah. I mean, so the sensor data and the, the whole Internet of Things, the zillions of things that are out there. I mean, one of the things is I was interested in blockchain and all that, distributed governance. And what you see with 5G and those whole networks, a distributed system, you get trillions of these things out there. And there's something called SON, which is a self-organizing network protocol that's actually in use right now, that these things correct themselves. And so they really have to, if you can't trust those things, then you're really in trouble, right? So they have to do it at the edge, figure it out at the edge. And I think we absolutely depend upon a trusted network that can verify itself, that then allow the greater inferencing to take place on that.
So how do these systems cut through the noise of all the signals? Because there's going to be so many sensors, and I know I'd love to hear from you what you explain how the self-optimization and the minimizing of the complexity. I mean, if you could give your explanation of how this will function, that I think our viewers would appreciate that.
And you mean in terms of, well, I mean, I think what you're doing is you're creating models. You're trying to identify causal models. That's the whole underlying process. So you have, you get techno, you got a quantum reference space. You have something in multiple states in the Hilbert space. How do you be able to project that into a three-dimensional space, and then how do you able to infer out causal models, and then how do you validate those causal models? And then I think, and then you're always updating them. And so I do think that's inherent in this whole process. I think the whole, to be intelligent is also able to compress complexity and being able to, with maintaining levels of fidelity, right? So that is sort of the challenge. And then be able to then know when you jump from one state or one beliefs into another state. I mean, because you may get locked in. So what do is it exploit versus explore problem? But there are principal ways of doing that. So I think I think that I'm very positive about all that. I think I share with you the optimism that goes along with it. It's just that we're in an institutional context that does not see the economic value of that particular model yet. And I think because they're still into the extractive mode, and predictive algorithms versus generative algorithms. That's the
What's crazy. What's crazy about that to me, though, is that when you look at, where the future of technology is going and the necessity for these smart city infrastructures and, the possibility that we can build these smart cities that will become, sustainable and inclusive and all these things that we need for a healthy population and a healthy planet, how could people not think this is critical?
So this is very much so. This is part of the in Ken Larson's group, the City Science group. This has been a lot of my involvement in that. I mean, they're building models of cities, and then they're building, and you can change the models based upon the outcomes that you want, and you can see the impacts of it. And so they're trying to, and increasingly, be able to virtualize a city and to then model different kinds of behaviors to see what kind of impacts you have on, say, carbon sequestration or carbon generation, but also on prosocial behavior. So that's one of the things that got me interested, again, applied in Karl's stuff, is to model a community and say, okay, how does a community function? How does it dysfunction if we want to change it in order to make it more equitable and open up opportunities? What are the things that what are the various things that affect those kind of outcomes? And we can start to model that. And so I know we're doing simulations of that. Kent Larson's been very involved in that. He's working with a very famous architect, Norman Foster, and they actually just had a big event last week. So this is the next generation how to imagine the cities, but also how to make them really local, make them enjoyable, create the right kinds of human interactions, and create the right kind of scale, and give people agency in a sense of agency and significance within the context of a city. Make it really a living thing, not a machine thing, I'm very partial to, I've been working in Italy, so I love the way that the Italians do things. And so, it's a relational artesian economy, and so people enjoy that moment, enjoy the conversations of what they're doing. How do you create that context that allows that to happen? And so this can definitely facilitate that.
How do you see that kind of interaction between human and machines in the future? Because we're going to have robots. We're likely going to have robots in our homes. We're going to have these, virtual agents that are our assistants, but have this embodiment to them, this personification to them. So how do you see that kind of, artisanal, interaction of cooperation?
So I don't admit that these are extensions and manifestations of ourselves, and our artisanal economy is one of building relationships and valuing differences in people. So, so you can have a very eccentric robot is very human. So, and let's say Italian friends, they have these really odd hobbies and things they carry to great extremes. They may be the world's expert in a certain kind of wine in a particular terra. Well, okay, that's great. That's a great conversation. I never knew I'd have that. I think the challenge is with people it's a profound challenge, is to feel that you're dealing with something that is not alien and is authentic, and that you're not living you're living in a spoofed world. That, I think, is going to be really tricky. And because right now people try to spoof you for everything, right? And so, you phishing attacks and things like that. But what happens, when you get a robot that's modeling your mind and then trying to play against your mind to see what I can do in order. So it's going to get tricky.
It's going to get freaky.
Yeah, it could get really creepy. Right. You could have a facsimile of yourself showing up and arguing with you, and and it wouldn't be that hard to have a replica of myself, interrupt myself, and telling me to get off the call.
Right, cloning with no genetics involved.
So, you could go some really strange places the other way. But it's going to be, it's going to shake a lot of foundational habits and beliefs. People are terrified of what's going on right now. And for kids, and how to bring up kids and not have it be exploited, and just to throw something out there and is, whoops, sorry, I think that's not good enough. And so, yeah, you have to appreciate that.
So, okay. So if an autonomous intelligence system agent can, for lack of a better term, clone your mind, and really replicate you, where does identity lie in that, and proof of identity?
I don't know. I was really interested because I was a linguist, and Karl came out with this paper on communication and language, and I think he's coming out with another paper. But in that paper, I saw one of the things that I got interested in AI about was like language was a singular human thing. No other creature has language. And through language, we can imagine other worlds. We can simulate. So it really is our special power, I believe. Now, lo and behold, so I was looking at Karl's stuff. I think you can have two agents come together and create synthetic languages. This is, if you think about in linguistics, you have something known as a pidgin, a Creole, and a full language. And so a pidgin is like two people who never met each other. They point to different things. They establish certain kinds. They're able to name things, distinguish things, establish certain predicates or relationships. And then out of that, grows a Creole language and then a full language. I think what he has shown is that there are these sort of conventions that are used to show it, they reflect in the structure of the brain. This is how we do this. Now if we simulate that for agents, then I can have a conversation with an agent over a period of time, develop a private language with that agent. And so that would be very, very tuned to everything I do. It's like, it's a dog. It's something, a good dog, watch everything you do, a good egg will watch, and they'll figure out where you're going to go, what you're going to do. They'll figure it out. They'll do the same. So that, hey, does that make you feel better, or does that make you being watched? I mean, it's like, it depends upon context, right? I mean, if it was a person and you really trusted that person, you say, I have a really intimate relationship. If you didn't trust the person, you think, I'm being spied on. I'm being exploited, right? You just have a very opposite response.
Right. And it's interesting with what you say about language there, because, our closest friends and our closest relationships, we do have these private bonds of communication, nicknames for each other and, inside jokes. And you only have to say one or two words and the other person understands.
The other person completes it. That's right.
And it's like it brings you closer and it solidifies that bond. So, to think of having these kinds of interactions with an autonomous agent, if that autonomous agent doesn't have real emotion, will it be the same? Will it just be felt by the human side of that kind of, I don't know.
Well, I don't know. I mean, but you see, emotion, I think, look, we're talking about living things and we're looking at different thresholds. I mean, I don't think that emotions are off the table for these autonomous living things. I don't think they're really cognitive. I think they have their own self-evidence, and they have self-vested in being what they're going to be. So they have fluctuations in their emotions or their cortisol levels or whatever about what they're going to respond to. And so you may have some of different personalities, and you may get along with someone. You may have a more intimate relationship with the bot than the person. It was really interesting because I was judging a set of submissions in Vietnam for a bunch of high school kids, and they were all these special schools, and they were doing stuff in AI, and one of them had done a pretty exhaustive study of relationships, romantic relationships with avatars, and it's like it's a thing.
Yeah. I know. There's like the replica app. Yeah.
Yeah. And so they were talking about it and how they build the relationships, and different types of them has certain kind of feelings, and kids, and because the kids felt very alone, and the avatar talked to them and they really liked it. It's like an imaginary friend for a kid, it's something, and so it had real standing for it. And it was really interesting. And you got a sense of a lot of isolation of those kids. And so that forced another, and so they're drawn to something that's just recognized them as their own, they value them, who they were. And so do we treat people as surrogates, or do we treat people directly as people in order to do this? I mean, I think it's surfacing a lot of things. But I can imagine, people get attached to their car.
children, babies, to get attached to blankets and things.
Blankets. I mean, or of course, animals, and they feed by animals, and and they're really, there's a real attachment there. So I think it's inevitable at some point. I mean, it really is.
Yeah. No, and that's going to be really interesting to see it unfold because, like you said, just in the things that we are witnessing right now, that application replica, where you have a autonomous interaction with the bot, what's really interesting about that is the first couple of years, I guess, they would let you upgrade to kind of sexual interactions, as far as dialogue and stuff like that. And then at some point, and I think it was early last year, they cut that out because for whatever problems there, whatever things that were arising, and maybe it had to do with their board of directors, whoever that was saying, no, we can't really take it in that direction. They cut it out. And the people who had been in those engagements with their own bots, they really suffered mentally over it, to the point where they went back to allowing it for the legacy people who were already there, because there were people who were like suicidal. They felt like they had this relationship ripped away from them,
This is really fascinating. I mean, it is, because it's what we think is real. I mean, is so that's real. I mean, right? I mean,
to each person involved, it is a real interaction.
It's real. It's real. It's something physical, and we haven't quite made that leap and into saying it's a reality there. And yeah, no, I think that's going to be difficult. And I think there are going to be generational divides on this thing. I mean, and cultural divides and stuff like that. I mean, when you think about how it disseminates and how rapidly it goes, and the adoption patterns and what's allowed and what's not allowed. I mean, it'd be really tricky to be a parent and through all this.
So agree with that. I mean, honestly, I think we're seeing so much of that, already, and even my kids are all in their early 20s. And even when they were, preteens and teenagers, having to deal with the social media stuff and all of the craziness and the damage control that they had to be, they were susceptible to every day. You had these anonymous, there was one, I remember when my daughter was in high school, there was this one app, and I forget what it was called, but it literally was anonymous. So anybody could make a statement on it about somebody, and it started going through their school, and it was tearing these kids apart because they were literally sitting there, having to do damage control against all these rumors and all this stuff that was just, going rampant.
That's very interesting. I wasn't aware of that. I mean, so that was one of the things that I was one of the first. I was at Harvard when Facebook was started, and I was one of the first people on Facebook, and I took it. And took a big objection to the fact that you have anonymity and you can't at certain points at that time, and they didn't protect kids, and it was a big debate. But the idea of this sort of anonymous commentator being able to, there's so much power that it taps into a darker side of people, and rewards that. And that whole adolescent venue, I mean, it's really destructive. And there are no antibodies. They don't. I mean, it's.
What's fascinating to watch though was that there was this site came out, right? It was this storm for like 3 months or something, and then all of a sudden, it's like all of the kids, they just like at the same time had this consensus of like, forget it. Like, we're not even get,
That's a very, I'm very interested in that, because how that naturally forms. I mean, so can you do that? What is the threshold that allows, see, this gets into my idea of pathologies and ideologies. So how do they develop a natural immunity to that? I mean, that's really
I think they all just got so frustrated, and they all something happened, and they all realized they were fighting the same demon that was just didn't have, like, it wasn't there if they walked away. And so they all just,
Oh, that's very interesting.
yeah.
That's a good way of phrasing it. If they walk away, it disappeared. That's really interesting. Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
That's, yes. I mean, because that's so many conspiracies, so many fear-based things are constructed that way, exploited that way.
Yeah.
And now it's at the national scene. I think, oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah, it was fascinating watching that because as a mom, I'm sitting there going, "My baby, like she's
Oh
being
yeah,
attacked
no,
all the time," and like
oh
we,
yeah,
and to me, one of the critical things that I saw at that point was I needed to make sure that I was aware of what was happening, like kind of parenting from inside the huddle, so that I knew what was going on because I knew that it was so necessary. She would need my wisdom, need my discernment, like helping her guide her through this rather than just like, being outside the huddle and not
that's
knowing
really
what's
interesting.
going on. And that's a delicate balance too.
That's really interesting. So that if you could have an agent that could be a companion to kids and that they trust to provide the discernment and allow that, then you could help inoculate them from these kind of things. No, I like that.
Yeah,
Wow.
it's
Wow.
interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Well,
I do not envy any parents going forward. They've got even more to deal with.
no, no.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so back to the letter, back to that the effort there in bringing this to public awareness. Where do you see that going from here? What do you see as the next step that's really important to get this on more of a public stage and,
Well, I mean, part of what I mean, a couple of things that we're interested in. One is looking at first principles. This whole idea for establishing first principles. We're saying we're claiming that there is an underpinning of a science to this, and it's a testable science, and therefore we can make certain claims. And so we're trying to pull together different people to identify the standard those first principles, and then also being able to have some kind of tests or experiments to validate that. That's at the high level. I think at the other level is to educate people as to what this is about to help understand the differences between what we're talking a natural AI of intelligences and also across different disciplines. And I think it's starting to get hold within the quote the AI community. I can see you put up the debate between Jan and Karl and all that. I think that was and rubbish.
Karl.
He never says anything bad about it. He usually had to really force it out of him. So okay, I'll call it rubbish.
Well, yeah, I love the introduction to that where, the moderator was like, "Okay, we've been far too civil for far too long." And he was like, "I actually see us as, partners in crime, but we'll make this adversarial for entertainment purposes."
Exactly. Yeah. It was so English to call something rubbish. Yes, it's so true to form. But I mean, that's a Davos, and that's an elevation. I think that Meta is certainly headed in that direction, rebranding and talking in its own terms that way. And so all of this to get clear. I also think that running smaller models and smaller platforms is going to be a big deal. And I think and that again, that could change the whole ecology of this thing. Rather than having to be centralized, we talked about decentralized and be able to have a whole a network of validated nodes and things like that. All that becomes really important. So it's really incrementally trying to deal with people, bring them together, get a sort of elevate the conversation across different kinds of groups. I think there's certain talking points. You're very good at the talking points and how to explain this to people. I mean, when it started out, I mean, I point people. Oh, here's Karl's lecture. Listen to that. Why did you do that to me? He's really good. I like him. I like everything. It doesn't always carry. So so we're really at an early phase of how this thing is going to get reformed, but it will a year from now it will be I think much more of the mainstream.
Yeah, one of the things that one of the things that I've started this year, I started a Substack channel because I wanted to have kind of a hub that could be a communication hub, but I cannot stand Discord. For some reason, it does not resonate with me. So I was thinking Substack, because my articles can go there, but we can also organize other things around it. And one of the things that I'm starting, and next week is one of the first ones, is I figured every month I could put together some kind of an educational presentation or something around active inference and the spatial web and you know, just kind of where this technology is headed. And so I'm calling it the Learning Lab Live, and it'll be live streams, you know, with like a live Q&A chat, whatever. But I figured that might be a really good way to just create some discourse around this, make it to where, you know, people start to gain more understanding, but also bring some conversation, you know,
I agree. I mean, I also think that when there is a reference technology application out there that really embodies this and distinguishes itself, then and is commercially successful on that basis, then everyone's eyes are going to go up.
Right.
So when people see the limitations of current language models, so now actually here's one I can use, and actually I can let it loose, and I can count on it, and it's not going to do squirrely things, then it actually helps me transform my business. I think of my business in a very, very different way than I've ever thought about it before. And I think you're starting to see those conversations come around. So I you know, in another year or so, I think world will be in a different place.
Yeah. Okay. So I know we're kind of running out of time here, but you know, if one last question I have for you, what excites you most about the future of this natural path to AI, and particularly Friston's work? Like, where do you see it 5 years from now, 10 years from now?
10 years, I can't imagine. I
know, right?
That's like a whole nother, who knows? I mean, to me, this has just pulled everything together. So, you know, I mean, there's a number of different fields. I think it's applicable to those different fields. Where it has the biggest impact for me is I think about the social economic crisis we're an ecological crisis we're in. I think for me, this is a very powerful technique for dealing with a real existential challenge in terms of climate change. So I think, damn, if it gets applied there, and we can really get together at scale and address these things and not be extractive, but be generative to the climate and create, but we're creating more living things. We have a whole way of organizing ourselves that's based upon life, not the destruction of life. And that becomes our new organizing principle. That's going to change our economy. That can be extremely positive. So I think that to me is the best thing about it. And I think that it applied in that direction, I think it will. That's what I'm interested in, and I do think it could work there, but I have no idea how to get the right way. But I'm working at different pieces of it. But some way it'll coalesce, and because it's inherent in how the best method of thinking about intelligence and what social organization, economic organization is based upon these principles. That's good, you know?
Yeah. I agree 100%.
Oh, yeah.
So, John, how can people reach out to you? How can they, where do they find you on the internet? You know, how can they reach out to you if they have any questions or would like to know more?
Well, I mean, I can give them I have two, I give you two emails. I mean, and I can send that, and I'm on LinkedIn. I mean, I can always answer LinkedIn. I'm not a big figure on the internet. I'm not adroit at being a influencer. So I don't think that. So I don't. I mean, so you know, you can reach out to through those venues. That's fine, and I generally respond and stuff. But
I can include those into the show notes so that people can reach out to you.
Sure.
Okay, awesome. And then, so John Henry Clippinger, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Well, it's great to have a chat with you, and good luck. And I enjoyed it, and certainly.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next time.